Good morning and welcome back to Bookish. This morning I woke up at about 4:30 a.m. and as I do when I'm awakened for whatever reason early in the morning, one of the first things I do is I check YouTube. And this morning I was watching some BookTube videos, and one of the channels I follow is called the Medieval Reader. I really like that channel, but she did a tag today, the BookTube Top 10 Tag, which was started by another channel I follow, but I hadn't seen this video yet. And that channel is called Old Blues Chapter and Verse, and I believe the man who runs that channel, or whose channel that is, his name is Jason. Anyway, what it essentially is it's a tag where you list your top 10 favorite books, or top 10 books you think are the best books, or whatever. But you make a list of your top 10 books, and I, being a book person and being kind of a list person, I thought this sounded like a good video. Since my channel's small, nobody obviously tagged me, but I thought I would tag myself and make a video showing this list. So here are my top 10 books. Now, you need to know, I didn't really come up with a definite standard or definitive standard by which to judge these books. These are just literally 10 books that when I was walking at my shelves thinking about this tag, I looked at these books and said, yep, that has to be one of the books. So I picked out a whole bunch and I narrowed that list down to 10, and if you ask me next month, the list might contain different books. Some of them would definitely be the same, but some of them would be different. So here we go on my top 10 book tag list. So my first book that I chose is this book right here, which I don't know that very many people have read. It's called Shadow Without a Name by Ignacio Padilla. This book basically tells the story of, or basically involves, whether or not there were these body doubles who stood in for Nazi leaders and took their place in dangerous situations, and, you know, kind of in an oblique way, in a four-part way, kind of, I think, tells the story of these body doubles and whether they were real Nazis or whether they were actually working for a Jewish underground resistance organization. It's a really good book, and there is some beautiful writing in here, and I always found the story to be somewhat haunting. So my first book, or the book number 10 on my top 10 BookTube tag list, is this book, Shadow Without a Name by Ignacio Padilla. So the second book I wanted to put on this list is actually probably somewhat of a violation of the rules of this top 10 book tag, and it's these three Patrick Melrose novels that I bought in kind of one paperback volume. If you don't know, the Patrick Melrose novels written by Edward St. Aubin are some of the archest, funniest, disturbing books recently written. The main character deals with all kinds of problems. He's a victim of child abuse. He comes from an unhappy family. He's from kind of the lower end of the upper crust English society. He struggles with drug addiction. He struggles with relationships. He struggles with friendships. They're just really good stories, and they're really entertaining to read, and the writing style is really unique, and St. Aubin's voice, I think, is definitely unique, and I really enjoyed reading all three of these. I'm not a particularly fast reader. If you've watched the channel, you know that, but I just tore right through these books. In some way, they just kind of like were what I wanted to read at that moment, and I really liked these books. So my number 9 choice on my top 10 BookTube tag list are the Patrick Melrose novels contained in this volume. And those three specific books are Nevermind, Bad News, Some Hope, and Mother's Milk. Sorry, I've been saying there are 3. There are actually 4. The number 8 book on my list is a work of nonfiction. It's called Gramercy Park, and the author of that book is Carol Klein. This is one of those books that's kind of right up my alley. I'm a history person, and this book is about intellectual history in the United States of America, and it kind of posits the theory that this neighborhood in New York called Gramercy Park functioned as kind of like the Bloomsbury of the United States of America. As a matter of fact, I believe that's right there in the title, and it contained authors and artists and actors, and they all kind of lived in this tight-knit community together. And I really thought this was a really interesting work of intellectual history. I don't know how much attention it got at the time, but it's one of those books that I read, and as a historian I thought, this is the kind of work that I find really interesting, and this is a really kind of unique work of history. So I really like this book, and so my number 8 pick is Gramercy Park by Carol Klein. Number 7 on my list is this book by Louise Erdrich. It's called The Round House. I reviewed on my channel La Rose by Louise Erdrich, which I really like, but I actually like this story a little bit better, and I like this book a little bit better, and this is the book that made me a real fan of Louise Erdrich. And if you haven't read her books, I think this is a pretty good place to start, and I really think this is an author who, despite the acclaim she has, deserves an even wider readership. I think she's, one of the best American authors writing today. So I would encourage you to read The Roundhouse, and it is number 7 on my top 10 BookTube tag list. Number 6 is another work of nonfiction, and this time it touches on a subject that's actually one of my favorite historical subjects, and that subject is World War I. I'm kind of a World War I history nut, and I read all kinds of books about World War I. So this book is called The Beauty and the Sorrow. It's by Peter England. And it takes a fairly unique approach to the history of World War I. Rather than talking necessarily about big battles or big events or famous people, it looks into the lives of really ordinary individuals and how their lives were impacted by the First World War. How it affected them, what they saw. It deals a lot of information in these stories, or in this book, comes from the letters of those individuals themselves, and I really thought this was an impressive work of history in terms of its research, the breadth of which it covered the topic, and the kind of somewhat original approach to the subject of World War I. So I would highly recommend The Beauty and the Sorrow by Peter England, and that makes it number 6 on my top 10 BookTube tag list. Number 5 is the most recent book on my list, and that is The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. I can't tell you how impressed I was by this book. I know that there have been people who have been confused by the idea that this is historical fiction and expected it to be historically accurate, but what it really is in some ways a metaphor or an allegory for the entire, I think, African American experience in terms of their treatment by government and American society in the United States of America. It's set during the period of slavery. It's set during the period in which the Underground Railroad operated. But a lot of the events and a lot of the situations it describes actually come later than that. And so in that sense, it's not strictly speaking historically accurate, but it does what I think historical fiction can do better sometimes than actual nonfiction, and that is that it gives you kind of the visceral experience of what slavery was like and what African Americans in the United States endured during the period of slavery and afterward. And it does that in a way which sticks in your mind because you become involved with the characters and you care about what happens to them. So the things it describes happening have a greater impact on you because they're in a work of fiction with characters you care about than I think they might have if you just read them in a nonfiction work. So one of the things I like is fiction that gives me true insight into history and allows you to experience that on a much more personal level. And while this is a novel and a work of fiction and a work of imagination, it does that for me in a really powerful way. There have been other books similar to this that have had the same impact on me, but this to me is a really great book and one of the best books published by an American recently. So from the newest book on my list to the oldest book on my list, the oldest book on my list and my number 4 on my top 10 BookTube tag list is Eugenie Grandet by Honoré de Balzac. Balzac is one of my absolute favorite authors. As a matter of fact, he's my favorite 19th century writer, and it was hard for me to pick one book by Balzac that I wanted to put on this list, but I picked this one because it's one of the more accessible books by Balzac, I think, and because the title character while a little bit self-effacing and a little bit unrealistic and naive, I think is one of the best representations of the power of women and the independence of women that you can find in 19th century literature. So I really liked Eugenie Grandet, and I thought this was a really good book, and it is my book by Balzac that I put in my top 10 list, even though there are a number that I wanted to put in this list. So my third favorite book on my top 10 BookTube tag list is The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. I have a feeling that when people see people on BookTube or elsewhere include, books like The Sound and the Fury that are notoriously hard to read, people assume that you're just posturing as some kind of a literature expert and that you put it on the list so that you could feel like, hey, look, I have an important book on my list. I've read The Sound and the Fury several times, and I find the story and the way in which Faulkner constructs this story to be incredibly moving and powerful, and I think the story is a really disturbing and great story, as is true of lots of Faulkner stories. As most people know, the story is told from different perspectives, most famously the perspective of a mentally challenged man in the beginning of the book. But if you read it often enough, you begin to see all the pieces fall into place, and you really begin to appreciate the power of the story and the inventive way in which Faulkner tells it. So number 3 on my top 10 book tag list is The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. So second on my list of top 10 books is Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. This is, I don't think there's any doubt that this is a masterwork of American literature. It's, since it was published relatively recently, by relatively recently, I think 1985, since it was published relatively recently, I think people have a tendency to hesitate to give it that kind of label, but Cormac McCarthy is a great writer. He may be the greatest American author still living and working in the United States of America today, and this is his masterpiece. It is gruesome, it is violent, it is disturbing, but it's all of those things in a way that advances a story really about humanity and about good and evil. And it is an incredibly powerful novel, and it is beautifully written. And once you get into the style, the artistic style of Cormac McCarthy's writing, you really can appreciate the beauty of this awful, terrible, violent, bloody, disturbing story. It is one of those books that when you read it, you are in some ways affected by it in ways that other books don't. So this is number 2 on my top 10 BookTube list. So my number 1 book on my top 10 YouTube tag, or my top 10 BookTube tag list, is The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. I hesitated to put this book even on my list, even though it is my absolute favorite book. I don't think there's any doubt about that. It's my favorite book for a couple of reasons. Number 1, this is the first work of literature that I read at a fairly young age, which I really got and I really understood and that I really liked. And I know Hemingway is still, amazingly to me, out of fashion in the United States of America. But this book is a great book, and it captures, I think, the ethos of post World War I, 20-somethings, 30-somethings maybe, better than any other book. And no, the characters are not nice people. And no, they don't do nice things. And yes, they live self-destructive lifestyles. But what Hemingway captures here is that moment in history after World War I. I told you earlier I'm a World War I kind of nut, and what a lot of people don't understand is how shattering an event World War I was. That World War I destroyed a lot of people's belief in human progress. That World War I, because it took technology and used it to the most destructive ends possible, was really dehumanizing, and it caused people to question what technology was like, and could modern society progress. It saw the breakdown of some of the world's leading cultural nations and them devolve into this incredibly brutal, grinding, faceless kind of warfare, and it had a profound impact. So I like it for that reason too. I'm going to do a video about Ernest Hemingway, and I know I won't be the first person to defend Ernest Hemingway, but I want to just say something. For all the criticism of Ernest Hemingway the person, and I'm not going to defend all his personal choices, he was a transformative author. That his style of writing was unique. He was self-consciously modern in his approach to writing, and he tried to create something new, and he did, and it fundamentally changed literature and American writing. And yes, he was a sexist, and yes, he seemed to like violence, and yes, he was a macho guy trying to cover up for deep insecurities, but he was also a man of tremendous talent and tremendous artistic sensibility who suffered terribly from depression. And you know, we forgive all kinds of writers other things in their personal lives. Maybe we should think about that with Hemingway as well. Anyway, there's my top 10 BookTube tag list of my top 10 favorite books. Please let me know what you think about in the comments, and thank you for watching.